Forsyth, who is the political editor of the Spectator and a columnist for the Mail on Sunday. He needs no further introduction. Next, Elizabeth Truss, who is MP for South West Norfolk and Parliamentary Under Secretary of State at the Department for Education, and who used to be Deputy Director of Reform, the think tank. And on my far left, Dan Hodges, a journalist, Blairite, Daily Telegraph blogger and columnist, and former Labour Party employee. So I think that's a great panel, and our speakers will all have 5 minutes or so each, and after that we'll open the floor for questions. Sajid, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for chairing this, and thank you very much to the IEA for hosting this event. Just some very short comments at the start, because naturally any successful government needs a policy for cost of living, and at this conference you've seen, and in political debate, especially in the last few months, more and more focus on what is your cost of living policy. Our cost of living policy is our economic policy, and obviously within that there's lots of specifically targeted things that we can do to, and we have done, to help with the cost of living. We accept that it's challenging for so many people up and down the country, but really the heart of it is our economic policy and our overall policy to fix the economy after the terrible damage it went through in the latter years of the previous government. And that's important. That inheritance is important because the problems that we have today really emanate so much from those years of recession, which was the deepest recession our country had seen in its post-war history, and the damage that was done, and the overspending that took place, which made that recession much deeper, much worse. Under the previous government, we had the beer duty escalator with the council tax escalator. We had the fuel duty escalator, but the biggest escalator of all was the deficit escalator. And so the heart of our policy of dealing with the cost of living is mending the economy, making it more stable, which means dealing with that deficit. I first accept there's no easy solutions to that. It requires a lot of hard work. And we utterly reject this idea that you saw emanating from Labour's conference last year, that somehow you can fix cost of living by just legislating for it. You can legislate whether it's price rises, you can legislate away inflation, you can legislate higher salaries. Of course, it's a complete nonsense. I think we all know why Labour has tried that strategy, but we're going to stick to our policy of doing the hard work and making sure that ultimately we get a stronger economy, the recovery continues, generates more jobs and wealth, and that's what ultimately will help people with the cost of living.
Thank you. James Forsyth.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Alistair and the IEA for hosting. I think Ed Miliband has done the right a favour in more ways than one with his conference speech last week, because although it's easy to say that that fixing prices won't work, it's a flawed policy, it will deter much needed investment in energy infrastructure and all the like, I think there is no doubt there is a big philosophical issue that the right needs to think about, which is how do we, in these sectors like the utilities, you've got a few very big companies, and when you've only got 6 energy companies, I think it does tend towards oligopoly, and I think there's a real challenge for the right. How are you going to get more competition in there, which is, I think, the right-wing answer to driving down prices. And I think there's this big question about how you get more competition into these markets that require huge amounts of infrastructure, where they are always going to tend towards bigger companies. I think one of the things that should have been said in response to Miliband more than it was if you look at the Labour years, you saw a huge amount of consolidation in the number of companies involved in these sectors between 1997 and 2010. We went from 14 high street banks in 97 to 4 at the end of it. You went from 10 energy companies down to 6. I think one of the things we need to work out is that competition is a good thing. We should be more wary of mergers that drive out competition in sectors. I think one of the other things that the right needs to be aware of is that a recovery on its own is not enough. I think a recovery in which people do not perceive their own living standards to be rising will be a voteless recovery for the Tory party. I think that the argument Miliband will make going into the election consistently is that this is a recovery for the few by a party that is only interested in the interests of the rich. Now, I suspect that 99% of people in this room would dispute that analysis, but there is going to be a political problem if people don't perceive that the recovery is benefiting them, which I think leads us on to another thing which needs, another kind of classic traditional Tory message that needs to become, and is I think becoming more part of the Cameroon message, which has got to be tax cuts, in that the right will win when it promises to leave people with more of their own money to spend. I think it needs to make the argument that because the state cannot use resources as efficiently as individuals, when the public sector expands, it leaves everyone slightly worse off. I think that needs to become more of the argument. I also think there needs, I think the kind of final point I would make is I think that one of the things that there needs to be a sensitivity to is the unavoidable bills. And that I think is, fuel duty, which is obviously being frozen under this government, that is rail fares, that is utility bills. I think those are going to form a political battleground for the simple reason that they are bills that everyone can't avoid paying. And I think, we hear that there is going to be some new work in the new year on kind of making markets work for consumers. I think that is going to be hugely important in winning this, if the Tory party are going to win this argument.
Thank you, James. Liz Truss?
Thank you. Well, I think the current debate that the Labour Party set off about the cost of living misses the point, because I think the free market is the best guarantee of low prices and goods that are available to all. This is because it's about individuals making decisions rather than the government making decisions about what the price should be or what level subsidies should be set at. And if we look at history and we look at how markets work, we can see that, for example, in the airline industry, when we saw Ryanair and EasyJet enter the market, there was a fall in flight prices of 50%. For the first time, many people who couldn't afford it before were able to go on holiday. And that was down to an opening up of markets and an opening up of competition. We also saw that in supermarkets. I remember in Scotland in the 1980s that the best kind of mozzarella you could get hold of was a dubious thing called Scottish mozzarella, which tasted like rubber. Now you can go in any supermarket in the country and buy the most fantastic cheese, and that is because of competition. And I think we need to stress those arguments about the way that you get democratic, low prices available to all is through open markets and competition. If we go all the way back to the Corn Laws, that was all about a row between the vested interests who wanted to keep prices high and consumers who wanted to see those prices reduce by, again, opening up markets. And we need to be on the side of those consumers against the vested interests. And I think that is how we'll make our case. It's about breaking down barriers to entry, attacking vested interests, and excessive regulation. All of those things push prices up. The energy market is a classic example of high levels of regulation, as is the housing market, as is the childcare market. All of those things families rely on, all of those things we see vested interests at play pushing up prices. So if I tell you about childcare, we spend as much as a government on childcare as both France and Germany do as a proportion of GDP. And yet parents in England pay twice as much as a proportion of their income as parents in France. Now, why is that? It's clearly that we are not getting the value for money that the French are getting. So the French have twice as many childminders per head. Now, childminders are home-based child carers who are generally more affordable and more flexible than nurseries. Under the previous government, the number of childminders in this country halved because there was an incredible increase in bureaucracy and red tape that they had to go through. So it's a direct example of where increasing regulation has led to increasing cost. It's not surprising that the biggest rise we've seen in the childcare market is actually nannies. Now, nannies, of course, aren't regulated at all. So what we have is a situation where wealthier people can afford to pay for nannies, which aren't regulated, and yet those on lower incomes have to buy highly regulated services where the regulation doesn't necessarily deliver higher quality or safety. Let me give you an example of a nursery I visited a couple of weeks ago called Baby Drop. Now, this nursery is a quite innovative idea. you're a freelance person, you're working from home, you're a stay-at-home parent, they will look after your baby for a few hours while you go to a meeting at work. Very, very flexible model, quite a high hourly price, but you can imagine it's really suitable for a lot of parents, a lot of working families. This is the process they went through. 28 weeks to get the planning permission to change the shop that they were operating from into a nursery. 3 different childcare registers, they didn't know which one they should join, and no one could tell them. Visits from both Ofsted and the local authority, not exactly clear about where the demarcation was between those 2 regulators. They were told they would have to make detailed observations under the early years foundation stage, assessing each child, even if the child was only there on a one-off basis for 2 hours. They also are subject to some of the tightest staffing requirements in Europe, which makes it difficult for them to run their business. And finally, they were told that there wasn't enough sand in their sand pit. Now, many lesser people would have been put off, but these 2 high-powered women, one of whom is a lawyer and one of whom is a marketeer, have persisted with their business and now want to franchise it across the country. But I think that's a microcosm of the issues that business people face in setting up businesses which are really popular with parents, which provide a service that working families want, but is very difficult to do at the moment. Many good people, I think, are put off red tape. So what are we doing about this? Well, first of all, we're liberalising planning. So if you want to change your shop or your office into a nursery, you can, without any extra planning permission. We're creating a single childcare register and having a single regulator in Ofsted, so there's only one set of hoops to jump through. We're increasing the number of hours you can offer childcare before you have to register, and we're also making it much easier to register as a childminder by enabling independent organisations called childminder agencies to create one-stop shops. So rather than a childminder having to go to Ofsted, the local authority, the insurance company, the accountant, there's a one-stop shop for them to go to. And we're also making the subsidies a lot less hoops to jump through to get that government funding. Now, this is a growing market with high potential. English parents spend an average 27% of their income on childcare. This is a massive issue, I think, for the next election, and it's something that we need to pay close attention to. And what I'm struck by is the resistance you do get from people who are already operating and don't necessarily want the innovative new entrants entering their market. But I think it's very much my role as a government minister to actually be championing parents and children who want these services to be available. It's often said that the argument for the free market has already been won, that we went through that battle in the 80s, that Mrs Thatcher made the case. But I think from last week's Labour conference, we simply know that isn't true. And I think it's up to us to regularly make the case for free market and competition as a way of delivering quality and value and low prices, and open it up to people on low incomes who at the moment simply don't have alternatives. I'm delighted that the IEA, who's unfortunately not represented on the panel, but maybe by Alistair Heath, has got a whole chapter on childcare in their book, because I think it is an issue that we should be interested in, like we're interested in energy, like we're interested in housing, because all of these markets have massive effect on consumers. I think making the case for the market is a bit like whack-a-mole, that every time you think you've won it, another mole pops up with a new idea about price fixing or creating a subsidy, and I think our job is to keep whacking those moles right until the election.
Thank you very much. Dan Hodges.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the IEA for hosting this event. It's a pleasure for me to be here, especially at the Tory Party conference. As an avowed Blairite, it's always good to be amongst ideological soulmates. I'm not quite making that leap yet, but you keep working on me, we'll see where we go. I think the cost of living debate, I think in broad political terms, offers you as Conservatives two big strategic advantages and two big strategic threats. The advantages first, I think, first of all, we have to understand why we're actually having this debate about cost of living. The reason we're having this debate is because the Labour Party has basically surrendered the debate on the economy to you. This is a tactical decision that was taken by Labour to try and shift the terms of the economic debate. And I think the last IEA event I spoke at, it was in the week that Ed Miliband had given a presentation in which he had cited the fictional chocolate magnate Willy Wonka in a presentation as the inspiration for his economic policy, and Labour's efforts to seize the economic high ground kind of went downhill from there. And at Labour Party conference, it was interesting the way that Ed Miliband paid very sort of minimal attention to the sort of broader macroeconomic issues. Similarly, Ed Balls, I mean, it was very interesting in his speech that there was no plan B, there was no more too far, too fast. The top line for his speech was, the potential cancellation of HS2 and the size of the Prime Minister's towel. And I think that shows where Labour is on the economy, so that's one advantage. Another advantage is, I think, cost of living should be natural Tory territory. Any time you start talking, you move the debate onto pound in the pocket issues, that's something where I think you have an inbuilt political advantage, particularly given where Ed Miliband is taking the Labour Party at the moment. I mean, there was a mistaken, I saw written in several places that Ed Miliband, after last week, was pursuing a new form of left-wing populism. He's not pursuing left-wing populism. What he's pursuing is simply left-wing. And if you look at those policies that he did, those announcements he did make, they were things that were very much within his own and the Labour Party's comfort zone. There was nothing left-wing. There was no populism in relation to immigration, in relation to welfare, in relation to law and order, in relation to civil liberties, in relation to Europe. And that's because Ed Miliband is pursuing what I've written about a lot, which is the 35% strategy. He's trying to lock in 35% of what he sees are sort of centre-left progressive voters, and he's effectively abandoning the centre ground, which is there for the taking if you feel obliged to take it. But there are also two downsides for you about this debate. The first is, despite his failings, all of which I've chronicled with tedious regularity, one area where Ed Miliband has been successful is he now essentially controls the concept of political empathy. And all the polls indicate this, Ed Miliband is the party leader who people most believe understands their pain, understands their problems. May not have that many ideas of how to solve those problems, but as I say, in terms of empathy, that's an area that he's successfully boxing off, and there are a number of reasons for that. The historic problems that you've had in terms of dealing with the toxification, if you like, of the Tory brand throughout the 80s and the 90s. The fact that in coalition you've been having to make some very difficult decisions which can feed into some of the critique that's been developed by Ed Miliband. And also, frankly, because he took a pretty disastrous decision cutting the top rate of tax at a time when you were asking the rest of the country to share the burdens and sort of tighten their belts. And that was, if Ed Miliband does make it to Downing Street, that out of all of the decisions that have been taken whilst he's been in government will turn out to be the most damaging. And another area of risk for you is that over the last couple of months, we have seen George Osborne and the Conservative Party and the coalition essentially take ownership of the economy. Now, up until this point, the tactic that you've been pursuing, which has been very, very successful, wasn't anything to do with us, it was all their fault. They were the people who were driving the car, they crashed the car, for goodness sake, don't give them the keys again, which is good. But obviously, to embed the narrative of economic recovery, at some point, George Osborne was going to have to stand up and say, actually, I'm in control, it's my economy now. And he's done that. Now, if the economy continues to improve, that's good. If it doesn't, you've got problems. And I think what Labour is calculating is if it doesn't, if the sort of the broader macroeconomic recovery doesn't feed through to living standards, then that is a way of them, if you like, reclaiming the economic issue via the back door. But the final point I would make, obviously we're going to have an excellent debate about the cost of living. It's absolutely right we do so. It's a very important issue. But remember this: at the end of the day, all general elections are won in the same way. They are won by the party that can demonstrate it has credibility in terms of the broader macroeconomic issues. It is won by the party that shows it has the most competent and most mature leader and leadership team, and it is won by the party that shows that it is most united, not divided. So important though this issue is, and important though it is for you politically to fight and prevail on cost of living, it is not the be all and end all of politics as we move towards the general election.